Well, hi everybody, and welcome to our class today on answers hiding in plain sight, using what you know to discover what you don't know. I have to say this is one of my very favorite classes to teach just because this principle has been so amazing in my family history work. It's actually probably one of the most helpful things that I've ever learned. So I'm excited that we can talk about it today. Hey, for those of you who are joining us for the first time, we are on the last class of our intermediate series. If you missed any of the previous classes, they are in our virtual archives, and Robert very helpfully posted the link to that in the chat. And then also we'll provide a handout at the end of this class that will have links to the slide decks and so forth so that you can get information on those past classes if you missed them and if you're interested. I wanted to also let you know what's coming up in the next couple of weeks, which I'm also very excited about. We, about a year or maybe 2 years, gosh, time flies, right? Maybe a year or so ago, we started a Boost Your Family History Brain Power supplement to both our beginning and our intermediate series. So the Boost classes for the intermediate series, the first one will be on March 2nd, which is recognizing problems in family tree and determining causes. And then on March 9th, we'll have the kind of the second part to that, which is once you've recognized the problems and found what's causing them, how do you fix them? So March 9th will be on fixing sticky problems in Family Tree. And then after that, we will start our Helper series, which is especially for consultants in the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, Temple and Family History consultants, but also for anybody who helps others with family history. So you might be the person in your ward, even if you don't have a calling for family history that people come to, or you might be the person in your family that everybody comes to. Those classes will focus on skills for anybody who helps others with family history. So we invite you to join us for those, and please feel free to tell your family and friends and ward members and so forth as well. So here's what we've got going on in today's class. First of all, when using what you know to discover what you don't know, it's very helpful to take stock of what you actually do already know. And then we're going to give 4 examples of using what we know to discover what we don't know. The first one is going to be actually a counterexample, so it's an example of what not to do, followed by 3 other examples, and we're calling them What Happened to Betty, The Missing Census, and The Mystery Daughter. So let's go ahead and dive in. But actually, before we do that, I did want to mention that this class today is not so much about research or genealogy skills as it is about thinking. So I've been doing family history for about 20 years, and when I started, I knew nothing. I mean, nothing. I was a novice as you could get. I was insecure. I didn't know what was going on. And I think I kind of thought that I had to develop these quote unquote genealogy skills, maybe get a certification or whatever. I still have not gotten a certification. I'm not a professional genealogist. My profession, I'm a writer and a teacher, so I'm not even, my profession isn't even genealogy. The reason I say all that is what I've discovered over the years is that thinking and logic and observation are probably the most important skills in family history. We don't have to be a quote-unquote genealogist or a certified professional or anything like that in order to use logic skills and observation skills. What do I mean by logic? Well, in family history, it's things like women don't have babies when they're 2. I've seen bad merges that resulted in women having babies when they're 2. Another is that men do not father children 10 years after their death. So these are things that we just know as humans, right? It's often just a matter of observing and applying these things that the things I just said to you, I'm sure people would just go, well, duh, I knew that. I know women don't have babies when they're due. We all know that stuff. It's really a matter of observing what's going on in front of us as far as the family and the records, and then also applying the things that we observe. So it's really about thinking, and all of us can think. I don't know. I love that because I feel like it makes it very accessible. We don't have to feel overwhelmed about being this professional genealogist. We don't have to. We just have to use the logic and observation skills that we all already have. Oh, one more thing. I forgot about this. In our classes, especially if you're new to our classes today, we always invite our participants to watch for what we call key takeaways. And that's just anything that you notice in the class that you think will help you personally or that will help you help others. We'll invite you to share at the end in the chat any key takeaways you got from class. The cool thing about it is that very likely you're going to get something out of it that somebody else didn't. And so by you sharing that, you're going to bless somebody else's life by giving them an insight that they might not have thought of, and vice versa. They may share something that didn't occur to you in the class. So we can all help each other learn. Okay, so let's start our first topic. What do you already know? Most of the time it's more than we realize. Let's take a look at some categories that we can consider. One is we can consider personal knowledge, which is especially applicable if you knew the person that you're researching in life, or if you knew somebody who knew them. So for instance, I got a lot of great information about my mother's grandparents, whom I never knew, but obviously she did. So by talking to her about them, I got some great firsthand information that I could not have gotten any other way. So personal knowledge can be a great source of information. Interestingly, often there's information on historical records like birth, marriage, death, census that we already have that we haven't necessarily paid attention to. At least that happens to me. I don't know if it happens to you guys. Definitely happens to me that I will be going, oh, what did this person do for a living, or where do they live, or whatever. And then I realize I've got the answers on the historical records that I've already found. And especially, oftentimes there's information on images that hasn't been indexed. And if we just look at the index, we miss out on some of that extra information. For instance, witnesses on a marriage record or something like that that can lead us to more information about the family. So information we've already got in historical records is another great source. And then finally, something that's super important is information about the time, the place, and the culture. Let me give you an example of what I mean about that. Almost all my family is from England. We're only newly to the United States within a couple of generations. And so most of my research takes place in England. One thing I learned from my mom, who was an English researcher, and also just from observation, is that in the 1800s and earlier, most of the time, I would say 95 to 97% of the time, women were married in their birth parish. Now, not 100% of the time, obviously there were exceptions, but at least back in the 1800s, that was most often the pattern, which helps me know where to look for a marriage for a woman, or it helps me to evaluate a marriage to decide whether it's really for my person, especially with a common name like Sarah Taylor or Jane Smith or whatever. So knowing about the time, place, and culture can also help you use what you know to discover what you don't know. Another thing that I found, you guys, which actually surprised me, is that it really helps to write down what you know. And it doesn't have to be anything fancy. So just a couple of examples that have helped me. Sometimes I will just do a simple stream of consciousness list to help me think through what I already know. So, hey, I found this birth registration and this christening for this person. She's not in the census. I found a possible death registration, blah, blah, blah. And just the act of writing that down really helps me kind of take stock of what I already know. Another thing that I've just got to share that I actually don't have an example of yet is that more than once I have been either writing an email to a trusted friend, like James Tanner is amazing. So I try not to, take too much of his time, but once in a while, if I think he's the only person that can answer my question, I'll start writing an email. But I realize that I need to tell him what I've already done so he doesn't repeat my research. And do you know what's crazy? In the act of writing out the email, saying what I've already researched and saying what my question is, very often I find the solution to my question. I've had that happen more than once. Also, writing an email to support. I think, okay, I've got to have their help with this. And as I write through everything, I end up finding the answer to my question. So writing your observations and your findings out can be extremely helpful. Another thing that is a little bit more formal is to put everything in a timeline grid. The purpose of this class, of course, is not to go into detail about the timeline grid. We've got 2 classes on that are coming up, I think, after the Helper series, if I remember right. But just very briefly, a timeline grid is a table that you create for a family where you list out the family members and then you list out everything you find about them in every census. And it just helps you kind of get a big picture of the family, see patterns, see consistencies, see inconsistencies. This is also a great way of taking stock of what you already know. So with that being said, let's look at our first counterexample. So Thomas Kittle, what's the deal with him? Well, this is a cautionary tale about the same name trap. What is the same name trap? It's when we think that 2 people are the same just because they have the same name, but they actually aren't. They're born in different places at different times. I mean, how many Jane Smiths do you think there have been in the world, like just in the 1800s? Probably millions. So especially if the person has a somewhat common name in England, Mary, Sarah, Elizabeth, Jane, and Taylor, Smith as last names, or if you're in a Hispanic country, it could be Gonzalez, Montoya, whatever. Every country has its very common names, and we just have to be so careful that we don't confuse 2 people that are different just because they have the same name. So let's walk through this little experience. Mary Jane Hydes was born in 1827 in Wisbech, Cambridgeshire. In family tree, she had no spouse. So somebody found a marriage record for Thomas Kittle and Mary Jane Hydes, and it was in the correct general area. So this well-meaning user added Thomas Kittle as Mary Jane's spouse. What was surprising is that they didn't attach a source. And then they added a death date, I think based on the marriage date. It's been a while, so I don't remember. But that was it. There was no source, there was the death date. So as I started working on this, I had to do more research using what I knew to discover what I didn't know. Well, as I looked at the Mary Jane on the marriage record to Thomas Kittle and found her in the census and so forth, I discovered that this Mary Jane Hydes was born in 1837, so 10 years after the other one, in a different place, same county in Cambridgeshire, but the parish was Leverington, not Wisbech. So, as it turned out, Thomas Kittle should not have been joined to this Mary Jane Hydes. He belonged with this one, born in 1837 in Leverington. So I had to do some repair work there. But this is just an example of using what you know. Actually, in this case, it was to fix a mistake, but the rest of our examples are going to show how we can use what we know to discover what we don't know and put correct information into Family Tree. So let's start our first case study, our first positive case study, figuring out what happened to Betty. I'd like to introduce you to the Entwistle family. There are a lot of Entwistles in Darwin, Lancashire. This is just one of many families there. The dad's name is Henry. His first wife's name was Anne. Unfortunately, she died, and later he remarried to a woman named Ellen. He and his first wife had a son named James, a daughter named Alice, another daughter named Martha, another son named Caleb. Well, as I looked through birth registrations for this family, I discovered a daughter that never appeared with the family in the census. I knew it was the right person because the birth registration had the right mother's maiden surname, and I was able to find a christening record in the correct location with the correct names for parents. So I knew that they had a daughter named Betty. But I equally knew that I never saw her with them in the census. Well, what could have happened? There's actually a couple of options. The person could have died in between censuses. That's a pretty frequent option, especially back in the 1800s when, unfortunately, infant mortality was pretty high. But I've also seen kids off to live with relatives. I've seen kids living with their grandparents and they didn't die. And so I thought, okay, I've got to do a little bit more looking here to figure out what happened to our cute Betty. Well, as I looked for possible death registration, I found one that was reasonable, but the Entwistles love the name Betty. There are about as many Betty Entwistles, just for what it's worth. They also love the name Alexander. You would think Alexander Entwistle is an unusual name, not in Lancashire. So Betty Entwistle, very common. This was reasonable, but I didn't feel comfortable just going off this information alone and saying, oh yeah, she must have died in 1875. I wanted to be more certain. So I decided to take stock of what I knew, get it all listed out so that I could use what I know to discover what I don't know. So facts about the family. We know that Henry and Anne did have a daughter named Betty, born in 73 in Lower Darwin, Lancashire. She never appears in the census. There's a possible death registration. And then facts about the time, place, and the records. The death registration would very likely list a family member as an informant, which would help me to know if that death registration was really for her. And then also, census and death records often list residences. So if the same residence was on the death registration as in the census, then I could be very confident that I had found the right death registration. So I decided it was worth it to shell out the tiny little bit of money required. They actually do digital images now at the GRO that you can get for £3.50, which comes out, last I checked, to be something like $4 or $5. So relatively speaking, that's a good deal. So I got the death registration, and sadly, this sweet little baby died at 19 months. You can just imagine how devastating that would have been to the family. She suffered with bronchitis for 3 weeks and passed away. Well, as we look at the informant, it is Henry Entwistle, and that matches the name of the father. But let's look a little bit more and just make sure. I thought, oh, I was looking for a cotton laborer because our guy was in the cotton mill, and it just said general, which wasn't as specific as I wanted. According to the census, power loom weaver, an overlooker, in other words, an overseer, so he was in management at the loom, but still he would have been considered a laborer. So The occupation was accurate on the death registration, but not as specific as I would have wanted. So I thought, let's look for more proof here just to be sure. Well, look what we got. Residence given as 99 guide, 99 guide. I don't know if guide is the name of a building or the name of a street. They didn't say specifically, but we do have that as a residence. And as we go back to look at the information, what we know already in the timeline grid that we copied from the census, look where they're living in 71. 99 guide. So now I feel 100% confident that that death registration is for Betty. She died at 19 months in 1875. So now I knew everything I needed to put her accurately in Family Tree. So we used what we knew to discover what we didn't know and add Betty to the family. First case study concluded. Let's dive into the next one, the missing census. So I'd like to introduce you to the Chandler family. I had found them in the 61, in the 81, 91, 1901. They're always living in the same general area in Wiltshire. Dad is Albert, mom is Eliza. They've got a daughter named Bessie, and they had other kids, but they wouldn't fit on the screen. So no matter how hard I tried to find this family, because at this point I was looking for like any other information that I could find, I've always found that to get a complete picture of the family, it's really important to find them in as many censuses as possible if they lived at a time when censuses were taken. So it was important to me to find this census, but no matter how hard I tried, couldn't do it. So what do we know? Let's take stock of it. Well, we have the full names, approximate birth years, and birthplaces for the other family members. The family lived in the same location in all known census records, which makes me think probably they're in the same location here. So the fact that I didn't find it doesn't mean it's not there. There's got to be something else going on. Because at that point in time, especially, let's back up and see, he was a preacher and a saddler or harness maker. These were not lucrative occupations. So for him to move around just for the 1871 census, kind of unlikely. Not impossible, but I'm thinking my best guess is they're probably in that location in 71. Well, one of the things that we know can be very helpful in trying to find this family in 71. Bessie's birth was registered in the first quarter, the March quarter of 71, which means she had to be born before the end of the quarter on the 31st of March, 1871, which means she should be in the 1871 census, which was taken April 2nd. So she was alive then. So if I can find her, this is a pretty unique name, and I've got a birthplace. If I can find her in the census, perhaps that would help me find the whole family. So quick taking stock of what we know. We know the names, approximate birth years for everybody. We know the location. We know when Bessie was born and that she should be in the 1871 census. And the names are a little unusual. So they're not Jones, Smith, whatever, very common names. What about time, place, and record? Well, it was very rare for a family to be missed in a census back then because the census takers were often from the area. They often knew the families. They would not have skipped them. It just often did not happen. Very rarely was a family ever skipped back then. And records can be misindexed. Our best efforts. I've made indexing errors. I'm sure that most people have. So we have to take that into account when looking for a missing record. Here is a strategy that's been helpful to me more than once in finding missing records. That is to search with what you know, except to leave off one of the names, such as the surname, although sometimes I've also used the surname and left off the first name. But in this case, I thought Chandler, little bit of an unusual name, maybe it got misindexed. We've got very specific information on Bessie because we've got her exact birth information, well, her exact birth when she was registered, so which narrowed it down to like 6 weeks. And so I thought, let's just search for Bessie without the surname. And I'm sorry, I just realized when I said narrowed it down to 6 weeks, I probably should explain that. When you're looking in English civil birth registrations, families had 6 weeks to register, or the person doing the registration, I should say, had 6 weeks to register that birth. So whenever the birth was registered, the baby could have been born up to 6 weeks before the time of registration. But that really does pin it down. So I knew that Bessie had to be born either the first quarter of 70 or possibly late 69. 70 was good enough for searching. So I put in 70, put the place where I knew she was born, and put her parents' names. But again, left off the last name on her, left off the last name on her parents. And look what came up first. I didn't even have to search hard, despite all my previous efforts having been unsuccessful. Well, it was an indexing error. Chandler was misindexed as Chander, and usually Ancestry is really good with fuzzy searching, but I think in this case, the fact that they also mistranscribed her birthplace as Oxford instead of Axford, and sorry, my apologies to Elaine, I know because she's from the UK, I know I'm saying that with an American accent, and she's probably cringing, but the point we're trying to make here is that the place of Oxford was not really where our Bessie was born. So between those two things, that's probably why the other searches did not bring up this family. But look, they're in the right place. They've got the right mom, the right dad. Everything matches up. And as we look at the image, we see that there were indexing mistakes. And this really is our family. So we have now found them in the 1871 census. We used what we knew to discover what we did not know. Let's dive into the last case study, the mystery daughter. Have you guys ever worked on a family that you felt particularly close to? This is one of those families for me. I love this family. I cannot wait to meet them. I'm just going to throw my arms around them in the next life and just be so grateful that I had the chance to do some research for them in this life. So, meet Edward Bescabie from my Bescabie line. Edward married Emma Elizabeth Smith. Unfortunately, she passed away soon after their marriage, and he remarried a woman named Emma Espin, which I thought was a very smart move on his part because he would never call his second wife, he'd never offend her or hurt her feelings by calling her by the first wife's name accidentally. Like if her name was Jane or something, he'd never accidentally call her Jane because they were both named the same thing. So how smart of him, right, to have two wives named Emma. So Edward had a daughter named Annie and a daughter named Gertrude. And as I looked for Gertrude, I wanted more information on her birth. I had information from her, of course, from the census, that she was born about 1885 based on her age, and I had a birthplace of Lincoln, Lincolnshire. But as hard as I tried, I could not find any birth or christening record for Gertrude. Now that didn't make sense to me because this was I knew that records had been heavily indexed in this area. The census was available, christening records were available. I could not understand why I couldn't find this person, like any birth records for Gertrude. So let's take a look at what we know about Gertrude so we can discover what we don't know. From her age in the census, we know she was born about 1885. We know she was born in Lincoln, Lincolnshire, and we know that she was born before Edward's second marriage in 1887, a crucial piece of information. The interesting thing is that her sister, Annie Louisa, was born the same year, so they could be twins, or Annie Louisa, she was born very early in the year. So the fact that she was christened in March indicates that she could have been born a few months before that, maybe as early as late 1884. So they either could be twins or they could be born just about, 9 months, 12 months apart or whatever. The thing is, Annie has a christening record and a birth registration. So why doesn't Gertrude? If they were twins, they should have been registered and christened at the same time. So let's take stock of what we know. Facts about the family. Gertrude was born 85 in Lincolnshire. She was born before Edward's second marriage. She was born the same time, approximately, as her sister, as Annie Louisa. And Annie has birth and christening records, but Gertrude doesn't. What else do we know about the time, the place, and the records? Well, at this time in England, it would have been very rare for a birth not to be registered. And as we said, if Annie and Gertrude were twins, they should have been christened and registered together, but they weren't. And names and relationships aren't always exact in censuses. So I was trying to think of other options. If Gertrude was born during the time of Edward's first marriage but wasn't christened with Annie Louisa, is it possible that she was actually the daughter of the second wife but born before that marriage? So following that hunch, and as I recall, you guys, honestly, like this was when I was inexperienced at English research, and the fact that there could have been an illegitimate daughter born before the second marriage did not even occur to me. So I was like praying and praying for help. I think I might have even fasted, and the idea came to me, and it was actually a very simple solution, was to look up Gertrude's birth registration with the second wife's maiden name, just in case she had been born to the second wife before the marriage. And indeed, I found a Gertrude Louisa, born about 1885. The registration was in Lincoln, so it totally made sense. But again, going off the index was not quite enough proof for me to feel comfortable. So I ordered the birth registration and discovered that indeed Gertrude had been born to Emma when she was single before the marriage. And so Emma had apparently brought Gertrude to the marriage, and then to Edward's credit, which I think is wonderful, just she was considered part of the family. In the census, she was known by Bescaby. It's very unlikely that he was the father because he was married to someone else at the time. Unfortunately, since she was a servant at that time, it's probably likely that she was taken advantage of as a servant. So in any event, we now know the correct birth information for Gertrude. We used what we knew to discover what we didn't know and make sure that her information was accurate in Family Tree. So I said at the beginning that this principle had made such a difference for me in my family history research, and I find that whenever I'm stuck, I need to use what I know to discover what I don't know. And about like 98% of the time, I do end up finding the information. Once in a while, there is a brick wall we don't break through, at least not yet, but most of the time, using what we know does help us discover what we don't know. So that is it, you guys. I'd like to invite you to put your key takeaways in the chat. And while you're doing that, and I bet one of the key takeaways is don't upgrade Windows 11. So I would accept that as a key takeaway. But while you're putting in your key takeaways, I will put in the handout for this class. Let me just show you how this is organized. If this is your first time looking at one of these handouts, I put all the stuff for one whole series in the handout. So it's got the stuff for the first class, second, third, fourth, etc. The class that we did today is this class number 5. So here is the link to the slide deck, link to the activity handout, and we'd love to get your feedback on this participant survey. So we'd love to know what you liked about the class, what you think we could improve, and we take your feedback very seriously. And then, of course, we've got the stuff for the classes that are coming up on March 2nd and March 9th. And also for anybody who's interested, we've actually found that a lot of us are related to each other. Like Elaine Newbold and I are cousins, Gordon Boley and I are cousins. I'm probably cousins with a lot of other of you in this class. So we made a relative finder group for our class where you can see if you're related to other participants. So if you'd like to join, just follow the instructions here. So I'm going to pop over to the chat and look at the key takeaways. Oh, Elizabeth said, how did you get those records in England? Is it hard to prove how you are related? Elizabeth, just briefly, the records that I found most helpful for that time period, there's 3 of them. One is the census that we illustrated on the screen. The other 2 that are particularly helpful are church christening records. So at that time, most children were christened usually in the Church of England, although sometimes in what they called nonconformist churches, which were not the Church of England. So they might be Methodist, or they might be Quaker, or something like that. I'm trying to think of others. It seems like most of the time I find Methodist, Quaker records. And then the other is government registrations. So civil birth registrations, every child by law was supposed to be registered. The registration database or whatever started in 1837, and compliance was not 100% right in 1837, but people got more and more compliant as time went on. So by the time we were into the late 1800s in England, most kids were their births were being registered with the government. So Elizabeth, that's a really high level kind of summary of good records. But if you want to know more about English research, there's 2 places I would look. I would go to the FamilySearch wiki because they give a lot of information about English records. And we also have some classes and webinars at the library on English research. And then, of course, you're welcome to do a virtual consultation. So I hope that helps. And Marge says, her takeaway was that family history takes thinking, logic, and observation. Yep. George says, key takeaway, think outside the box, don't give up, make a timeline, and list out what you know. Nancy says, question, should I spend the time to untangle a great aunt's husband's line that looks like it has the wrong information? Nancy, that is such a good question, and I'll tell you what my conclusion is on that, honestly, as a woman of faith, is to pray about it. There is way more to do in family history than any of us will be able to do, and we have to set priorities. So honestly, I would pray about that and see where the Lord would guide you by His Spirit to spend your time. Let's see, Alicia says, oh, she liked the idea, the search strategy of leaving out the surname when you're doing a search to try and find somebody that was hard to find. Sister Ferguson said her takeaway was to search the census in a different way. And Randy says, look at the original records instead of the index. We have so many good key takeaways. Julia says, take a breath. Take the time to review what you know and don't rush to make assumptions. Julia, I love that. And BJ Colbert says, I've heard this in class before, but this time it sunk in that writing down what I know is really important. I will be writing down what I know from now on. I love that. So Gregory gave some good advice about untangling a mess to Nancy. Says it's hard, but it sharpens your skills in merging, source attaching, and detaching, and it can be very rewarding. I agree, Elder Brown. Dawn says the takeaway is Edward and Emma as a wife. He has found a second wife with the same name, but not shown as a second wife, shown to be the same person as the first wife. So he says Edward was smart, but we all need to watch for the same name trap as well. Dawn, well put.